visit the series regularly, and I've seen a lot of my friends like John Weaver and Terry Waldo playing over here over the summer. And to those who might not know me, I am Charlie Judkins. I play mostly early American syncopated piano styles, in other words, mostly ragtime music, and early jazz and early blues music as well. I'm the protege, I suppose you could say, of my good friend, many years, Terry Waldo, who also plays the series. I know I just started to be redundant already. I'll probably get a bit of that. And so I think this is about my 5th or 6th year of playing this series. I've been having so much fun, I've lost count. But as I do almost every year, I like to make this series a little bit of a tribute.
Hey, Rolf.
Terry and 2 other pianists who have passed away, who are good friends of Terry's, the late Trevor J. Tishner of St. Louis and the late Bob Wright of Chicago. All 3 of these guys were active in starting around in the 1950s, 60s at that time. At the time, ragtime music was kind of forgotten. The Sting had not come out yet, and the famous recordings of Joshua Rickman playing Scott Joplin and other influential things in the ragtime world had not yet happened. And these 3 fellows I just mentioned were early on dedicated to for keeping this music alive, basically doing things that I do now, such as collecting historic sheet music and recordings, and studying how to perform ragtime and early jazz styles in an authentic period manner. There were a lot of ways to perform this music in the early 20th and late 19th century. There were regional styles all over the country and eventually all over the world. This music spread out of the American Midwest. Many say out of the St. Louis area, some say out of the Ohio River Valley area a little more, some say more out of the New Orleans area where jazz music allegedly eventually originated from. And all 3 of these folks I mentioned, Terry, Trevor, and Bob Wright, were all learning and performing these tunes. They made a lot of private and public wonderful recordings of these pieces. I'm in my early 30s now. When I met Terry about 15 years ago, he started me on the road to performing this music. He introduced me to the recordings of Trevor and Bob. In the case of Trevor, I actually struck up a friendship with him and talked to him on the telephone quite a bit. And through all 3 of these guys, I learned and heard many great pieces by many great composers that I myself wanted to learn. And now that
Sounds like it's going to be a great performance. Definitely should be here for a moment and enjoy a little bit of it.
I have the scores and recordings to learn these pieces myself, so I'm going to perform some of these for you guys today and call attention to some of the regional styles. So I think I'd like to start out by playing a piece from my friend Trevor's home city of St. Louis, Missouri, written by the great Tom Turpin, who was the first published African-American ragtime composer. His first published piece being the Harlem Rag in 1897, but I'm going to play, in Trevor's memory, I'll play a rag Tom Turpin composed in the year 1903 called the St. Louis Rag. Dang you.
Awesome.
Yes, that's the St. Louis
Hey,
Rag
Stephanie.
by Tom
Hey,
Turpin.
Paul.
A little background on that piece. It was composed to tie in with the famous St. Louis World's Fair that occurred in 1904. It was supposed to occur in 1903.
What comes to mind? Silent
Why they
movies. Silent
published
movies.
in the year 1903, but unfortunately, due to electrical problems, the fair was delayed by I think about 6 to 8 months, something like that. So the piece came out a few months too early to be successfully plugged by the fair. But nonetheless, I think it was probably the closest thing to a hit that Turpin had because it was recorded in his lifetime more than any of his other pieces were. But I suppose while we're at it, I'll talk a little bit more about Tom Turpin and play another one of his rags. He's a very important composer. He was born in Savannah, Georgia in the 1870s. His family came to St. Louis, I believe, around 1890. I would double check that. He started his career playing at a very famous African-American club in St. Louis that existed in the early 1890s called Babe Connors. And there, Tom Turpin, around the age of 19, started working, playing ragtime music very early on before it was nationally mainstream and known to the public, especially not known to white audiences at that time. And he accompanied a singer named Mama Lou, who may have been his own mother, Lou Turpin. That's not known, but my late friend, Bryant of the Scott Joplin Foundation, estimated that that may have been the case. And Tom Turpin also became one of the most politically powerful and important African Americans in St. Louis in the early 20th century, along with his brother Charles. They controlled and owned many locally important and well-funded theaters and nightclubs, such as the famous Rosebud Cafe, where Scott Joplin and many other early African-American St. Louis ragtime performers hung out and played, and also had what were known as cutting contests, which were informal piano contests. And Turpin also operated several, I guess you could say, less legitimate businesses, or the shadier ones, such as gambling houses and what was known at the time as sporting houses. Well, we didn't think you know what these places probably were. Anyway, yeah, that's a nice way to think about it. It's something different than that. But anyway, as I said earlier, Tom Turpin was the first published African-American ragtime composer, at least to have a piece published with the word rag attached to it, therefore, night and day being known as a rag. And that piece was the Harlem Rag in the year of 1897, so I'll try my best to perform that one.
Awesome. Awesome. Hope you're enjoying it. Welcome. And don't forget to give us a like and subscribe if you're not subscribed yet.
Publisher, so there's many ways to play it. I played it as closely as I can remember. And I would point out another interesting part is that features a very early notated use of what's known in the ragtime and jazz community as the circle of fifths, in which you have a chord going down from the root. What's known in the number system as 6. In other words, re, fa, sol, la, the 6th tone in the scale. The 6 to the 2 to the 5, and then back to the 1. And that was a very early use of that when the code was published in 1897. And in the decades that followed, that became a more mainstream device. If you listen to country blues records of the 1920s, you'll hear that device used quite a bit. And there's also some popular songs, such as Ball and the Jack by Chris Smith, published in, I believe, 1914, that use that same device very explicitly. But that's probably, in the Turpin's Harlem Rag, is probably one of the earliest uses of it. Now, as long as I'm talking about the St. Louis-based performers before we move on, may as well play one by the great Scott Joplin. I'll play Mr. Joplin. I'm by no means an expert on his music, although I love it. I recommend the great biography written by Ed Berlin if you are looking for more information on Scott Joplin, or the great 1940s research text, They All Played Ragtime by Rudy Flesch and Harriet Janis. Scott Joplin was originally from Texarkana, Texas, I believe, but he arrived in St. Louis in the 1890s, and that's where he made his name, and also taught many, many students, both black and white, young people, and definitely left his mark and local influence. And some of his favorite rags to play are some he wrote in collaboration with his students, so I'll play one of those. This one was written, I believe, around 1902 or 1903, and it's called Something Doing, which must have been a popular slang term of the time, because there was at least one other rag by the same title by a composer named F.H. Losey, who's probably not aware of this Joplin rag, because Scott Joplin's music was not very well known outside of small musicians circles until many decades after his death. But anyway, here's a piece that Joplin co-wrote with his then brother-in-law and student Scott Hagan. It's called Something Doing. Thank you.
Awesome.
Something doing.
ACR Spot and Pink Peony. Hey, and thank you for your
All right,
likes.
well, before I move on from St. Louis, I'll play another rag to show how things changed there a little bit later on. Many people probably don't realize this, but just as jazz music changed over the years from what began as traditional jazz and evolved into swing and later bebop, there were also many styles of performing ragtime that changed from the 1890s to the 1900s to the 1910s until eventually it morphed into what is now known as jazz piano. But those specific period styles of ragtime that existed in that 20-30 year time span are harder to label and characterize because they've all always just been labeled as ragtime music and nothing else. But the way ragtime piano was played, even just in St. Louis, changed dramatically in the 1910s. That's a good story to demonstrate that is the story of the great pianist Charles Hubbard Thompson, one of my favorites, who came up in the days when Scott Joplin and Tom Serpent were still big names in St. Louis as a young teenager.
Shall we listen to another number and then we'll continue walking, perhaps? Not to get you bored too much, but are you enjoying the music? Hi, Lai. Good afternoon.
Charlie Thompson had been playing all over the country and had been picking up influences from outside of the city, including some from the great New York African-American stride player James Price Johnson, who was later known as the teacher Fats Waller. So with this expanded repertoire of tricks and piano skills, he entered a contest that was held, I believe, annually at the Booker T. Washington Theater in St. Louis, which Tom Turpin owned and controlled. So there was an annual ragtime piano contest there, where the winner of the contest would have to compete against Turpin himself in the final round, and almost always, probably not entirely fair since Turpin himself owned the theater, but Turpin was almost always declared the winner. Now, in, I believe, 1916, 1917, around then, allegedly Charlie Thompson's skills were so great they could not be denied, and even in the final round of the contest, he was able to unanimously be declared by the crowd's applause the winner of the contest, and so he effectively cut Tom Turpin. So to give a little example of this later 1910 style of ragtime, St. Louis-based ragtime piano, as opposed to the earlier style popularized by Turpin and to some extent Joplin and his proteges, I'll play Charlie Thompson's Lily Rag, which was published in a simplified form in 1914 in St. Louis, but he recorded it himself many times, many years later in the 1940s for small regional record labels. So I try to capture a little bit of the feel of Charlie Thompson's live performances of this piece rather than go by the simplified notated score. Thank you.
Awesome.
Let's go Lily Ranch by Charles Thompson.
Don't forget to subscribe if you're not subscribed yet, with all notifications. Welcome, welcome.
That are today associated with boogie-woogie music, which did not become mainstream popular in America.
Dusty Cole, hey
until the late
everyone, how y'all
1920s
doing? Hey
and
Dusty Cole, welcome, welcome.
To an era of mass popularity of the style in the 1930s.
Doing great?
However, like many American syncopated music styles, this style existed for many decades in underground clubs and so forth before it was labeled and made mainstream through recordings, sheet music, etc., etc. However, the blues itself became mainstream a little bit more before that. And the blues
Welcome everyone, this is Bryant Piano in Bryant Park. It started at 12:30 in the afternoon, and we're here for now. It's 12:55.
And so,
That's some red times. Judkins.
So I'll try to play one now by the great Kansas City pianist Udale Bowman. This is a very early published blues from, I believe, 1914. He was from Kansas City. He worked in the red light district. I'm sorry, he was from Texas. He worked in the red light district in the Kansas City area in the 1910s. That was published there around 1914, and it's called Colorado Blues. Don't ask me why. Possibly he spent some time performing in Colorado. Just give me a moment here to get my sheets in order. Alright, here we go.
Okay, another one's coming up right about now.
Thank you.
Awesome, hope you're enjoying it.
That's the Colorado Blues by Udale Bowman from 1950. Now, for the sake of comparison, I'll play one of the famous blues by the great W.C. Handy, the best I can remember it anyway. It's been a little while. W.C. Handy hailed from Memphis originally, and today he's probably best remembered for the St. Louis Blues, but he wrote a series of blues compositions that were very, very influential in the early 1910s into the 1920s, and St. Louis Blues, again, being my best remembered and most performed today, but my favorite was always the Memphis Blues, so I'll try my best to render that from memory for you.
Awesome. Hey, Devlin Walks. Hey, Juan Manuel. Saludos from Argentina. Grace and John. Hey, Nana, how you doing? And Lee. Hi, Lee. Good to see you.
I'll play a nice little piece by another influential Midwestern jazz and ragtime composer, the great Jelly Roll Morton, hailed from New Orleans, Louisiana. In those days, being a pianist was certainly an itinerant business, which meant you traveled all over the country, regionally changed things up. That's a little harder to do now, although I do have some professional jazz musician friends who do that from time to time and change it up. But it was more of a on-the-road life back in the early 20th century, I would say. Jelly Roll Morton traveled and worked all over the country after leaving his native New Orleans.
Hope you're enjoying this performance in Bryant Park with streaming live.
In Kansas City, and he wrote a tune around 1908, although it was not recorded and published until many years later, around 1922 or 23, I believe. This tune is called The Kansas City Stomps, and again, that is plural, although we'll probably never know why. Thank you.
Awesome. Should we continue walking or should we be here a little bit longer and listen to something else? Let us know.
Published Midwestern rags here. I suppose I'll play one from the Nashville scene now. This one was written by the great Charles Hunter. Charles Hunter was a blind pianist recording house pianist and a piano tuner from Nashville, Tennessee. He had most of his rags published by the Henry A. French Company of Nashville between, I think, around 1899 and at the year of his death. But sadly, like so many great ragtime composers, Charles Hunter did not live very long. He was blind, and he wrote and played entirely by ear, I believe. His first and most popular published rag was called Tickled to Death, but rather than that one, which is not under my fingers anymore, I think I'll play my favorite Hunter rag, known as Possum and Taters from the year 1902, a ragtime piece.
Awesome.
Thank you. Now, for comparison's sake, and sticking with the Nashville theme, I will play a piece by probably the second most prominent Nashville ragtime composer of that time, or the other, I should say, second in ranking. The great Thomas E. Brody, who hailed from Illinois. He was African American, unlike Charles Hunter, who was white. I do believe that the two of them probably knew each other. Both of them had their rags published by the Henry French Company. So if they didn't know each other, I'm sure they were aware of each other's work, and there are many regional similarities in style.
Good afternoon, and why?
Thomas Brody, also like Hunter, died very young. I don't think he even reached the age I'm at now of 31. He died around 29 or so. A victim of the sporting life, as they called it back then, as so many great ragtime pioneers were. Brody was born and educated in southern Illinois. He moved out to Nashville in 1897 to work at the Tennessee Centennial Exhibition on the fairgrounds, although he may have also been performing music. He was a mandolin player in addition to a composer, arranger, and pianist. And he left us with only 3 rags, unfortunately. Here's a good old rag by the great Thomas E. Brody, and this one's called Whittling Remus, and it was the last rag he wrote in the year 1900, 7 years before his death. Thank you.
Yes, we are in Bryant Park. Hi, Julian. Hi, Esther.
Take a break pretty soon, but I will play here until 2:30. Gotta make sure my hands don't fall off. So I'll play 2 or 3 more here, switch it up. I'd like to start working my way out of the Midwest and talking about some of our East Coast composers from here in New York City, where there was a wonderful, wonderful jazz and ragtime scene going back to the 1890s. Jazz and ragtime music both became nationally popular because they were popularized by groups that performed right here in the city and recorded right here in the city. Ragtime was popularized by Ben Harney in vaudeville at Tony Pastor's Theater. In the year 1897, Tony Pastor's was on 14th Street, now by Union Square Park. There's a plaque there you can see. Many years later, up in the Columbus Circle area, jazz music was made nationally popular when the original Dixieland Jazz Band from New Orleans, Louisiana became popular, playing at a club called Rising Wyverns, which was right over in the Columbus Circle area, right about where Jazz at Lincoln Center is now. So we have a very rich history of music, syncopated music styles here in the city. Also, Teeny Pan Alley was here in the city. The city was the central publishing hub of songwriting publishing in the country in the early 20th century. We just had 28th Street, West 28th Street landmarked the other year, where all the publishing houses is. So I'd like to get into playing some East Coast composers. So at the end of my set, I think I'll start with that. I'm going to play one by a nice New York-based composer and band leader named Jesse Greer, who's probably best remembered for...
Hey Mark, good afternoon. Happy Judkins Monday to meet us at Bryant Park. Nice and clean and family
Some
friendly.
nice little novelties in the early part of his career, and this one was pretty popular around the year 1927, and it's called Flapperat. It's going to be a minute here to...
Big one moves. Good afternoon, beautiful day.
Committed to memory. Flamperette by Jesse Greer. I suppose I'll take a quick little break to rest my fingers. I don't want to, but I probably should. I can play again later tonight. So I guess I'll play one by, I mentioned the great James Price Johnson earlier. And they called him the Dean of Harlem piano players. He wrote many memorable standards, such as the Charleston, If I Could Be With You 1 Hour Tonight, but he also wrote many wonderful stride piano instrumental pieces. He was called the father of stride piano.
Good afternoon everyone, and hope you're enjoying this afternoon concert in Bryant Park. Ragtime music, amazing performance, and most importantly, it's free for all. Beautiful day in Bryant Park. That's phenomenal.
Sorry for that. I turned this off to prevent the feedback, but thank you so much, and we'll take a quick